This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and we are back to an old favorite of mine, my friend David Mittelman, who is a geneticist, an entrepreneur, and a CEO of a company called Othram, which we discussed 3 years ago, which is, in the life of this Substack, it's when the Substack was a baby stack, less than a year old. We were still trying to figure things out. So I think, we've come far, and your company has come far, actually, David. And so for the new listeners, we will talk about the nitty gritty of how you do what you do, why that matters, how the science technology has been translated into, the criminal forensic space and how it's relevant to policy. But first, just give us an update on all the different things you've done since the last time you talked to us in June 2021 and the spring of 2021.
Well, for newer technology, 2021 seems like a lifetime ago. There's a lot that's happened. We have now applied forensic genetic genealogy and the kind of DNA testing that we build and offer as a service. We've now applied it to more cases than anybody on Earth. There have been thousands of identifications made, more than 400 that are on our website. We recently celebrated the 404th public announcement with a special shirt and a little bit of a meme riffing off 404. We called it Cold Case Not Found. And then we also have taken this technology, historically there's been a trade-off. Do you want the best technology and the newest technology, or do you want something that's robust, that is accredited and works in the regulatory framework? And we don't think that compromise is acceptable. So we took all the work that we've done, and remember, we were the first lab to do this work back in 2019. And we took all the work we had done, and we've now secured accreditation through ANAB, ISO 17025 forensic accreditation. And in Texas, we're licensed by the Texas Forensics Commission. So we have the accreditation and regulatory framework in place to offer the new and latest and greatest technology, but instill the framework that's expected regulatorily, the same kind of accreditation that you'd see and expect from a public lab.
Yeah, so a public lab, like you're talking about, what kind of labs? Like FBI's laboratory, what are you talking about there?
Yeah, so the public labs in Texas, we have a great scientific laboratory at the Department of Public Safety. So there's the DPS lab, there's the FBI labs. In most states, there are across the country, a few hundred labs that are operating at the local and state level, and there are some federal labs. And these forensic labs do specific testing for forensic casework, for crimes, for human remains, and they all follow this universal standard, ISO 17025, that essentially ensures that they've got the quality system and the framework to do things in a way that would be expected in forensics.
Yeah, there's a lot. I want to. I did some time in the trenches in veterinary genomics and stuff. There is a National Fish and Wildlife Forensics Laboratory in Ashland, Oregon. It's run by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's devoted to wildlife law enforcement. So there's all sorts of labs out there doing all sorts of things. Some of them with best of breed, new technology, and some of them not. I have seen, on some of the listeners will have, seen on social media and other places some of the things that you guys have been involved in because you do, when you do solve a cold case, you do put it out there. Can you talk about some of the things that you solved just to make it a little bit more concrete for people? Like, what are the notable cases in your mind? I mean, as the youth would say, some of the stuff is actually pretty good content so far as, there's, I don't know, it's like someone that died 60 years ago. Wow, that's pretty crazy that there was still a cold case and you guys could get data out of it, right?
Yeah, so I'll share a few stories. So, we're from Texas. We work across the United States, local, state, and federal, and then also internationally. But I'll share you a case from Texas. There was a case involving this young girl, Carla Walker. She was a 17-year-old cheerleader, and in 1974, she was murdered. She was assaulted and murdered, and this is in the small town of Fort Worth. There really wasn't any leads. They initially thought it might have been the boyfriend. He was excluded years later. They thought it was a whole bunch of other folks, but they couldn't figure out who it was. And this case, languished for almost 50 years, and there was a lot of pain and damage caused by this case, friends, family, community. And in the end, in 2020, we got involved with the case. They had actually looked to do advanced testing elsewhere. In the process of doing that, they consumed a bunch of evidence and got no good result. And we can talk more about that when we discuss the specifics of the science and the technical side. But, there are not a lot of ways to do this in a way that is safe, secure, and likely to produce a good outcome. We did eventually get a hold of a small piece of evidence, and we were able to provide the investigative leads that led Fort Worth Police Department to the suspect in the case. So DNA found on her body that, tied to an unknown male, which we then helped identify. And he was arrested and charged with her rape and murder. And she then went to trial in 2021 and was convicted. And this was the first case in Texas. And I think it might have been the first case, one of the first cases anyways, in the United States, where it didn't just go to court, but this technology was front and center. We testified and were cross-examined on forensic genetic genealogy. So a lot of folks will tell you, don't worry, this is an investigative lead and leads don't go to court. All this technology is going to court, and it should. It should be examined and explored and understood. But it's one thing to identify someone that did something terrible, and it's another to be able to support that identification in court. We ended up in court actually earlier this year. I testified in front of the jury in another case involving Mary Catherine Edwards. She was a school teacher in the mid-90s, murdered in her own home. And it was a really weird case because there was no sign of forced entry, yet she was assaulted and found handcuffed in her tub. And her parents found her, unfortunately. It was probably a terrible thing to have to come across. And again, for decades, the answer eluded the folks in this case. This was, again, in a small Texas town, Beaumont. And it's one of the worst things that happened in Beaumont that was not solved. And so very similar to Carla's case, we were able to help the Texas Rangers. We did this case with the Rangers and with the local Beaumont Police Department. And we were able to help them identify the person responsible. And again, this case went to court, and I testified in the jury trial and was cross-examined on the use of forensic genetic genealogy. And again, was able, the prosecutors were able to secure a conviction. And we do a lot of those kind of cases. We also work cases involving human remains. They won't go to court. But, I was shocked to learn when I started Othram, there are, upwards of 50,000 to 75,000 unidentified remains in this country. That's a lot of people that have died, many of them homicide victims. How do you even work a homicide if you don't know who the victim is? Some of them are not homicides. Nonetheless, they're all human remains. They're unidentified and they're just piling up. And the National Institute of Justice calls this a silent mass disaster. It's something that we care very deeply about. So we also work human remains cases, and we do this in collaboration with RTI. And RTI is the administrator of the NamUs program, which is the federal effort to catalog all of these unidentified remains. And our work has also been used not just to identify suspects as well as and also victims, but also to exonerate. And so we have cases where we've been able to find the correct person after someone else was previously accused. And we're even involved right now in a few cases where we're trying to help build the case for an exoneration for someone. So our technology is powerful in that it can identify anyone from DNA, really. But the real intent behind what we do is to bring certainty to investigations. You have these investigations that can cost, and I kid you not, like a couple $100,000 and run for years and tax the very kind of limited human effort that is available in policing, and we can take all of that with a little bit of technology, and for a fraction of the price, just find out whose DNA is there. And sometimes it'll be a suspect, sometimes it'll be a victim, and sometimes it'll be someone that we're trying to exonerate. It may be someone whose DNA is at the crime scene but is not relevant to the crime. The point is, you have to bring certainty as quickly as possible to the investigation so that you can provide that information to investigators and then let them work the next step in the case. Uncertainty is the enemy of criminal justice. It's what causes the delays, the prosecutions of incorrect persons, is what causes the ambiguity in a system where, defense attorneys and prosecutors have to go to court with certainty.
Yeah, let me, some of the weirdest things that I've seen, there's you and a couple of other companies or a couple of other teams that are doing this genetics work is, people say most people are killed by someone they know. Honestly, that makes the detectives task easier, right? It narrows the space of possibilities. But that's not always true. There's a minority of cases where there's just random killings. And, I just recently read about, partly just because it's the Pacific Northwest, I keep track of stuff in that part of the country. And, a teenager was sexually assaulted and drowned in Montana, I think 35 years ago now. And, there was no lead for all those years. People use genetic genealogy to look for a potential match because there was no match in the criminal, database, CODIS. They found someone who, they found a match to someone who had a relative that lived in the local area. The person was actually a fisheries biologist, married family man. He was about 20 at the time. He lived in the area. The police interviewed him, and actually, unfortunately, he committed suicide after the interview. Obviously, he had committed it. But this was someone, they must have committed a crime of total opportunity. There was no criminal record at all of this person. They were an upstanding member. They were married with 2 kids, upstanding member of the community. But they had done this horrible thing all those years ago. And, honestly, they thought they had gotten away with it. But, again, you have DNA of somebody, but, there's no match in the criminal database. To be honest, most, crimes are committed by repeat offenders. So the numbers there make it so that you have a good shot. If you miss that, it could be anybody. It could be anybody in the local area, and there's just not the resources. So I think this shows you the power of this sort of technology. Let's talk a little bit about the details, because I think a lot of the listeners have watched. They watched CSI. They watched how it's done. And this was a big deal in the 90s with DNA technology and O.J. Simpson and the Innocence Project. But things have changed a lot since the 1990s. Our DNA extraction protocols have changed. They've got much more powerful. Genomics was basically invented in the 1990s and has come to fruition in our time. And then we also have direct-to-consumer tests that have democratized DNA and have allowed things like doing genealogical matches. All of these have transformed the landscape. Can you talk a little bit about them from a perspective of a technologist and a scientist?
Sure. And I just want to preface and say there's probably more detail and kind of level of depth that we can go into that probably will exceed the time limit of a podcast. But I will tell you that anyone that's interested, we have a research site. It's research.othram.com, and anyone can go out there, and we've got just a whole bunch of stuff, open access research that we've done and published in peer-reviewed journals, blog posts, explainers, even some previews of software and tools we're building. So anyone can get more information after this at research.othram.com. You touched on a number of things, Razib. I just want to make a comment on CODIS and the standard STR testing and this idea that it can track repeat crime. That's the purpose of CODIS. It was nationalized in '94, and it created this federal system, nationwide system, in which you could essentially build STR profiles. This stands for short tandem repeat. STR profiles for people that have been known to have committed a crime. They get and then are convicted of such a crime. They're deposited into this data system, CODIS, and then when they commit another crime somewhere else, if they are able to develop this STR profile for the crime scene, they can compare it and say, in fact, there is a match to someone in CODIS who has known to have done something, who's known to have been involved in another crime. And so if you, Razib, commit a crime, in California, and then you end up in the database and later on you commit a crime in Texas, then in principle, Texas should be able to upload the crime scene and they'll match it to your profile that was originally collected in California. It's a very powerful tool. In practice, though, even for repeat crimes, you're identifying people less than half of the time, because here's the thing: is not everyone that's supposed to be in CODIS gets to CODIS. There are tens of thousands of folks, this has been reported in the press, that are supposed to end up in CODIS and somehow they don't make it, and that's an issue for another day to discuss. There are a lot of crimes, as I'm sure you can imagine, that predate CODIS in 94. And really, cases that are pre-2000, a lot of those hadn't, been fully tested with STRs yet. So CODIS is very powerful if you've identified someone, because you can kind of keep tabs on if they associate with other crime scenes. CODIS is also very powerful because you can associate crime scenes. Even if you don't know who's responsible, you can say, these 7 crimes are united by a common DNA profile. The challenge, again, though, is that a lot of people aren't in the database. And if you look at, I talked to you earlier about human remains, these are usually victims of homicides. They're never in CODIS. So you're talking about like low single digit percentages in which CODIS will help. CODIS wasn't designed for it, so it's fine, but like it's just not a good tool for those kind of crimes. And there are people hiding in plain sight, as you mentioned. It's funny, you draw this parallel to the story that you were describing that you had read about, but I'll take you back to Carla Walker's case. And in that case, the guy that murdered her, it was a crime of opportunity. She was 17, he was in his 30s. He was drinking, sees her by chance in the parking lot and decides to take, a chance and do something terrible. He continues, shockingly enough, for the next 46 years to live in the same community, hiding in plain sight and going, to church and going to the grocery store, living like a mile or two away from Carla's house. So it's just crazy. And then, what a shock when we eventually help investigators identify him. So there are many classes of folks that do terrible things, but there's a class that we've, kind of helped discover now of people that have done things maybe a few times. This person's been tied to other crimes, but, obviously never caught, and live their life seemingly ordinary, hiding in plain sight. And that's terrifying. There are all these folks that have done terrible things hiding in plain sight, and they just simply won't be identified without this technology. Some of them go on to die or age out of crime, and then they'll never make it to CODIS. So you really need these other techniques. And I apologize. I think I kind of missed your original question, which is kind of what are the technical differences between CODIS testing and what we do?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the 1990s, there's a certain amount of DNA you could get. Now in 2024, it's totally different, right? So one of the reasons that you're solving a lot of the cold cases is the kits that are kind of like archaeological specimens that are sitting there are all of a sudden accessible to your techniques, right?
Yeah, there's really 2 things that have happened. So the first thing is, in the late 80s, when people came to adopt STR testing, there was a certain set of equipment and protocols and methods. And, there were certain things that were economically feasible that allowed you to measure, about 20 markers. And like I said, they're called short tandem repeat markers, STRs. So people built these profiles with about 20 markers. Honestly, it started with 8 markers, then it was 13. Now it's about 20 markers that you can get in a CODIS profile. The first thing that's changed is in the last, decade and a half, the advent of massively parallel sequencing lets us to get all this information. You don't need to get 20 markers. You can get, 500,000 markers or 1 million markers. So that's the first thing, is that there's technology now available to very cost effectively get, 500,000 to 1 million markers. With that kind of information, you can do a lot more than say you are or you are not in the database. You can learn about where they're from. You can identify these distant relatives, and that's what powers genetic genealogy, for example. But that's one part of it. One part of it is we can get more data and we can get it very cheaply. The second thing that happened is that there was a kind of an explosion, one that you have followed personally, and so have I, which is a personal genomics kind of explosion. And, when I was at Family Tree DNA, I was their chief scientific officer, 10 years ago. I remember we were talking about, hoping that across the world, there'll be 1 million people that have tested their DNA with a consumer test. And back then, people were doing it to find, their relatives. People that were adopted wanted to find their parents. Some folks just wanted to kind of learn where in the world they're from. And so there was like maybe 1 million people tested back in, say 2013. And by 2019, there's like 40 million people tested. So the ability to get data and to do it cheaply from a crime scene, for example, has gotten progressively cheaper. And then at the same time, the amount of data available from which you could then do a meaningful comparison, in terms of a genetic genealogy search, has increased as well. And, while there's 40 million people that have tested, only a fraction of those have consented for law enforcement search. But nonetheless, there's a pretty consistent, number that consent. And so as the databases grow in totality, so does the population of folks that are consented. And so there are, at least a few million people now that have consented to have their DNA profile used to help identify suspects or victims or exonerate people. And that's been very powerful. So those two things kind of working in parallel, and they kind of collide. The inflection point is around 2018. We actually wrote about this in one of our papers. It's almost not incidental at all that the timing was as it was. The costs had just come down. The data got really large in terms of people participating. And by 2018, people realize it is now both feasible and also practical to do this kind of work. And that's honestly we started Othram in 2018, and by 2019 we were processing casework. So timing worked out really well.
Well, I mean, I think to a great extent, this is an information technology marvel in terms of with the genetic genealogy and kind of the triangulation, all these different things that you're doing. Could you just talk through how that works in terms of the segment matching, the databases you're looking in, then you find the relatives, and then you narrow it down with non-genetic resources?
Yes, of course. So there's, in my mind, I see kind of 3 parts to this process. The first part is you need to build a DNA profile, and you can't build a DNA profile of 20 markers. If we built a profile with 20 markers, if you and I were brothers, Razib, we may share half of the markers. That's already 10 markers from 20. And if we were cousins, we don't even have the resolution to detect that kind of relationship. So the first step is we need ultra sensitive profiles to detect not some of your genetic relatives, but all of them. And so that involves building, profiles with 500,000 data points. And that's just something you can do pretty straightforward if you're working with, DNA that comes from your bloodstream or a buccal swab. But remember, working with crime scenes. So there was a lot of technical innovation to enable low quantity, low quality, mixed DNA, chemically damaged, and perhaps sometimes burdened by bacteria. How do you take that kind of really terrible kind of DNA input and still get 500,000 good data points? That's step one. And step two is you have to perform a genealogical search. And something that I think wasn't appreciated, maybe still is not appreciated, is that the algorithms that power these genetic genealogy databases are consumer algorithms. So they presume single source, high quality DNA with complete profiles. And that's fine if you have single source, high quality DNA. But, a lot of sex assaults and even homicides are going to be cases in which you have DNA where there's both a contributor that is unknown, and that's probably your suspect, and then a known contributor, which is the victim. And it's not perfectly possible to separate those two contributors in a profile that has 500,000 to 1 million markers. And so search algorithms need to understand that, and they need to accommodate for that. And if you're working with a single source DNA that comes from human remains, but the remains are old or they're chemically damaged, you won't get every single data point you're looking for. So the second part of this, after you build a good profile, is you need forensic search algorithms. And we're the first company on earth to build one. We run the largest database collective available for forensic genetic genealogy. And this combines the work that we've been doing with Family Tree DNA. That's the largest consented database for criminal search, and also our own database, DNA Solves. And so that's the second part, is you need the search algorithm. The third part is that you need something to search against, and you need the tools to be able to do the work that you're doing. So we've built this platform. It's called MDFI. It stands for Multidimensional Forensic Intelligence. This is the longest name we could think of. We're not marketing folks, so you may have a better name, and we'll take your suggestion. But for now, we'll call it MDFI. And MDFI is a data platform where you can take your profile, execute a search, get back the matches from the genealogy database. These matches are the people that are genetically related and also consenting for being included in the results. And then you need to build tools, because at the end, you can't hire enough genealogists to work all these cases. There needs to be some level of tools and semi-automation. And so we started building a lot of that. We can automatically cluster and reveal family lines. And we're working to help investigators essentially with very little genealogical experience or training be able to at least remove some of the more laborious parts of the process. The idea isn't to fully automate genealogy. Some cases may automate, but the idea is that using machine learning and AI, we should be able to remove a lot of the busy work involved. And we should be able to just build tools in general, even if they have no AI in them, just tools in general that simplify the process. And so right now you can perform a search in our system and have, automatically triangulated segments, family lines identified, surnames clustered, and you're good to go. In the very near future, hopefully early next year, we're looking to have, suggested trees and other kinds of analyses that will help investigators get started. Humans should be working on human problems, like how do you disambiguate two people that look similar because of their name or where they're from. Humans should be trying to understand records that are inherently hard to parse. Humans should not be, screwing around with trying to figure out which match goes where. These are things that are rather algorithmic and formulaic and can be reduced to computers. And we have a saying at Othram, which is never send a man to do a computer's job. So anywhere we can save the person a little bit of labor, we try to do that. Our goal, again, isn't to tackle a few cases. It's to tackle hundreds of thousands of cases. There are hundreds of thousands just in the United States, unsolved violent crimes. And there's, over 1 million violent crimes every year. Not all of them will be someone that or easily solved. And so there's a substantial workload. And it's not just being able to build the profile, the search, and the tools, but it's being able to do it in a robust and scalable way so this technology can be used by everybody.
Yeah, so I have a question about that. When this started happening, 6 years ago with the Golden State Killer, spring of 2018, one of the first high-profile genetic genealogy discoveries. It was kind of ethically controversial or whatever. People were worried about the consent. I mean, how do you respond to people that are worried about things like genetic privacy?
So I think, the tools that we use, in my opinion, they're probably among the most private tools that you could utilize for these kind of investigations. So you have to remember, if law enforcement doesn't have a lead, then they've got to go find leads. And in the case of, the Mary Catherine Edwards case, for example, we talked about that case. And I believe this was true in the Carla Walker case, but in Mary Catherine Edwards' case, they DNA tested a whole bunch of people. They just went and DNA tested, people they thought were her friends that were male, people that were not her friends, people that just knew her. They were testing everybody in a very undirected way. I mean, what else can you do? Law enforcement may have to knock on everyone's door in a neighborhood and try to figure out if anyone saw anything or heard anything. So the technology we use allows you to kind of very quickly, and this is a really important part, it's very fast. And so being able to very quickly narrow in on a lead, saves you a lot of time and money, and then also essentially restricts the scope of the investigation. So you're not having to, unnecessarily invade people's privacy and talk to all these folks and test a bunch of people. You can narrow in very quickly to the answer. And then of course, there's just the general trade-off. I mean, all technology comes with risks that need to be understood. They need to be debated publicly and discussed and regulated. But at the same time, like, there's an overwhelming of the criminal justice system with cases that are not worked. There's a public safety issue. And as much as, people have a right to privacy, so do the victims. Being sexually assaulted is a huge invasion of privacy. And if we have technology that can be utilized to, prevent future victims, right? The recidivism rate for sex assault is very high. You have 20 people assaulted, by a single person. So being able to catch people early in their career instead of later, isn't just a more precise way, that limits the scope of the investigation, but it also prevents future victims. So I think there are trade-offs that needs to be discussed openly, but to the extent that it can be done in a very secure, fast and private way, we certainly design things as best as we can to operate that way.
Well, one of the objections that I remember people making when this started happening is that, you don't know if some people would get angry that their DNA is going to be used to, their DNA result is going to be used to, arrest their cousin or their half sibling or whatever. Have you ever encountered a case where someone's objected like that?
Well, I mean, what do you mean by objected? To us objected?
Yeah, I mean, have you heard that? They're kind of mad that their DNA was used to arrest their relative.
I mean, sometimes when someone is arrested for a crime, they're upset that somebody's relative was used. But in terms of, someone being upset that their information was used, we're not aware. I mean, we don't work with information that isn't consented by the individual. So if you don't consent, then we're not using that information. And in fact, DNA Solves, the DNA Solves database has no other function. Like you can't really get anything out of it. Like the only reason to be in it is to help an investigation. So no, I haven't come across that. But I mean, certainly people have levied arguments, on the defense side. Someone's been, identified as the perpetrator in a crime or the suspect in a crime. And they may argue, that there's been a usage of data and somehow this is, impacted someone's privacy. I'm not a legal expert, but to the extent that we can, we do work with data that is consented. We advocate strongly for informed consent and not just blind consent. If you go to our website at othram.com, we have an entire page dedicated to explaining exactly what we do and don't do with data, how this impacts you, what the risks are. And so, my background is biomedicine. I trained at Baylor College of Medicine. The idea of informed consent is not a new concept. But in the end, there are a lot of people that are either looking for a loved one they've lost, or they're looking, to help pay it forward and identify, the person responsible for the next crime. And so I think they're largely supportive of these efforts.
Well, obviously in the 1970s and the 60s, when some of these crimes were occurring, like people weren't thinking about DNA. I mean, DNA was something that was scientifically known, but very few people in the public were very aware of it. And obviously, forensic genetics was just starting to get off the ground. They were still using blood group, analysis back then. So do you think, what are the possibilities for mischief in this realm, in terms of, I don't know, someone somehow getting someone else's DNA and planting it at the crime scene? People wouldn't do that in the 1970s, obviously, but now,
I think, look, DNA testing was not available in the 70s for forensic crime scenes, but it's been utilized since the, mid to late 80s. And I think there's always a concern, right? These questions are always raised. Did someone plant evidence at the scene, genetic or otherwise? These are longstanding questions and concerns that predate any of the work that we're doing. It's literally the nature of forensics. In a forensic investigation, you have to assess whether the evidence is there or is not. I mean, forget about DNA evidence. You could be pulled over and someone could plant illicit drugs in your car. And how are investigators to determine if those are your drugs or someone else's drugs? So these kind of issues are issues that are very real and very important, but these are issues that we've faced for decades. The only difference And DNA has been collected for decades. The only difference is instead of, collecting DNA willy-nilly and running it through a system like CODIS where, you may or may not have a hit and essentially you're passively waiting for that person to strike again and then be properly caught, prosecuted, and entered into CODIS. Instead of doing that, we're taking a more proactive approach. So the risks, the concerns, they've been here since the beginning. Anytime anyone is accused of anything, that's why you have to go to court and argue, every angle of this case and examine the case. But what we do is we simply reduce substantially the amount of uncertainty in the investigation. We shrink the duration of the investigation dramatically, and we do all this for pennies on the dollar. And so the thing is, if Othram didn't exist, people would still need to figure out, whose DNA was at the crime scene, and is there enough evidence to prosecute so and so for a crime? All these things are going to happen regardless. The only difference is with Othram in the picture, we can do it really quickly, which is, again, not just a cost savings, but it is a savings of people's lives, of their safety, and we can do it in a way that is just very, very, very certain. There could be many pieces of evidence at a crime scene, and knowing, essentially the totality of who is at that crime scene is important. You don't want to look at part of the crime scene; you want to look at all the evidence, and you want to know everyone that was there. And then you want to make the decision to decide, to figure out who is the person that you want to then approach to discuss whether they were or were not involved. It's kind of like, having better cameras. If you have a street cam, you may see a number of cars that passed license plate readers, a number of cars that passed a crime scene at a certain time. And you can then research, which cars were there and who are the owners of those vehicles. And is there, some reason to suspect they may have been involved? Data is powerful because data brings you information. And if it's done in a way that's quick and cost effective, it brings you information that can really help you close out that case without tying officers up for years. I mean, you have to understand some of these cases they go on, they span multiple investigators' careers. And there are other things, other needs and priorities in policing. You just can't devote all the manpower to chasing someone in these cases. At the same time, it's unacceptable to just let the case linger, right? And families need answers. So there's finite manpower. There's people that need answers, and so the only solution is technology. And that's why folks say technology. So the common phrase, technology is a lever on the world, right? So this is what allows us to basically help the policing effort do more with less. They don't need to hire more investigators. Often they can't. There's already a shortage of manpower. And for a fraction of the cost, they can get these answers quickly. And now you don't have this problem. The law enforcement folks can be more effective and people can get their answers faster.
Yeah, I mean, so you're doing, you're arguably even less, and you're doing more with less. That's obviously the ideal scalability. I know that these are your goals. Where are you going in terms of the future? So, obviously, there are these cold cases you guys are targeting, but there's DNA all over the crime scene, everywhere, right? Are you expanding the purview, or are you focusing basically on the cold cases because you got to get through them first?
We work cold and contemporary cases. If you remember, last fall there was a case involving a mom of five, Rachel Morin, and she was sexually assaulted and murdered in a suburb in Maryland, while she was jogging. And this DNA was entered into CODIS, and it hit against another crime because CODIS was doing what it's supposed to do. It hit against another crime in Los Angeles involving, someone and their child that were attacked at their doorstep. And so they have DNA now linking these two cases on opposite ends of the United States, but they don't know who the person is. And that was a contemporary case. And obviously this guy was doing things, it turns out he's probably done more, but he's at least done two things in a short period of time. And so the Bureau got involved with a local agency and then brought us in to see if we could apply forensic genetic genealogy. And we built a DNA profile for this guy. And sure enough, we were able to help the Bureau and local law enforcement identify him. And he was an illegal alien from El Salvador. He wasn't in a government system. So like, not only was he not in CODIS, he was invisible to the US government in its entirety. And he'd actually murdered someone in El Salvador, skipped town, came into this country, I think running with gangs or whoever he was running with, and committed, a crime in Los Angeles, then in this suburb in Maryland. I think they found him when they finally tracked him down. They found him in Oklahoma doing other stuff. So that's a contemporary case. And again, it's like I told you, people will keep, these folks will keep doing the same thing over and over again until they're caught. So he got caught early in his career. I think he's like 23 years old. So he won't have that long list of victims. Hopefully he's done very little. And there are other cases. I mean, if you visit our website, you'll see we work cases that are, 6 months old, and we work cases that are 60 years old. We've worked cases that are even older. We identified human remains from a woman that was born 175 years ago. So I always tell law enforcement, if your case is less than 175 years old, we can help. So I think this technology should be applied to cases that are days old and, a century plus old. You've got to get rid of the cold cases because they continue to tax the system and they burden law enforcement. And there are people that are not going to live forever that need to know what happened to their loved ones. So those cases have to get cleared. And then sometimes these people are still alive doing terrible things. So another good reason to clear them. We've identified through cold case work a number of folks that have sexually assaulted people that are still alive doing things. So they need to be identified and taken off the street. And then you need to work contemporary cases for the obvious reason that they're a contemporary and real-time threat. So we work really hard to make sure we can bring our technology not just to any kind of case, but to also contemporary and cold cases. And another reason why we've been developing technology to kind of semi-automate and streamline the process, because in a contemporary case, you just don't have time to do things as manually as some might like.
Yeah. So, you were talking about 175 years in the past. Let's talk about like space, geography. We're talking about the United States. Is the empire, is it going to expand outside the United States? How are people thinking about this sort of thing in other countries where, frankly, the resources for law enforcement are way lower, right?
Yes, this certainly can be true. So, we've done everything at the local, state, and federal level in the United States. We also are now the most common provider in Canada. And in Canada, a lot of the forensics runs through, labs in Toronto. The Toronto Police Service has been, instrumental, as has the RCMP, in deploying this technology. And we work with both of them. And, the Toronto Police Service has their own investigative unit for genetic genealogy. So for the Toronto Police Service, we generally just build DNA profiles. They're doing their own investigative work, which is remarkable. And so we've worked countless cases in Canada as well, human remains cases. We identified Gordon Sanderson, who was a First Nations man. He was brutally murdered 40 years ago. And at least on Wikipedia, so I take this with a grain of salt, but on Wikipedia it said they spent $1 million Canadian, which has to be what, like at least 700 or 750,000 US.
Yeah.
$1 million Canadian trying everything, forensic sketches, isotope analysis, anthropological work. We identified him in a few months, and it cost us, less than 10 grand. It was really cheap. And we immediately identified him, found his sister, done. And he was First Nations. He wasn't necessarily the easiest genealogy case. We've, helped exonerate someone, in Canada. We've identified a number of violent predators. Elsewhere, we started working in Australia. We contract with the Australian Federal Police. I think Australia is very eager to use the technology. They're a little bit newer to the field, and they're doing a lot of good work, as Canada and the States has done, in doing privacy assessments and designing that right workflow. You brought up earlier, like, what about the privacy and consent, and how do you do things in a secure way? They're definitely thinking through how to do that. One of the really great things about our technology is that it's largely automated and it's done entirely in one kind of structure, completely in-house. And so this makes it very, very secure. And then the fact that it's fast allows us to very quickly target to an answer as opposed to doing kind of an untargeted and just kind of exhaustive, search of everything. And we're working in the UK and we're working in Europe. And I think the UK and Europe, they're a little bit more nervous or maybe shy about discussing some of the work that they're doing, but it's happening. At the end of the day, there are too many cases in the States. There are cases globally, and we're all human. We all have DNA, and we can all benefit from using this technology. Unfortunately, we all have our own local problems with unidentified remains, unsolved crimes. So this is a very, very, very generic approach. It's also an objective and unbiased approach, which is why I love it. And it's something that is truly scalable that could bring value to everyone. And, here in the States, we've used it, like I said, thousands of times. The bottleneck right now in the United States is just mandating it, right? It's just setting the expectation that you can't just test DNA. Running DNA is not appropriate. You have to actually provide investigative leads. So something that would shift criminal justice towards a little bit more of an outcome-based approach, I think would be good. And then something where you're actually looking at tools that are both effective, but also cost effective. When we do the work that we do, we like to think about it in terms of dollar per solve, right? So if you've invested some budget, a crime lab has spent a certain amount of money in a year, or a private company spent a certain amount of money in a year, or an agency has. How much have they spent, and what do they get for that spend? How many people were identified? And so I think that's a good way to look at it as well. It's a very powerful tool, and if used appropriately and if properly legislated, I think it would just completely reduce a huge source of pressure and burden for law enforcement, and it'd make the world a safer place at the same time. So it's a win-win for everyone.
Well, okay. The last thing I want to ask you about, because and we've talked a little bit about this. So the genealogical stuff, like you can get with a really high precision, ancestry you can get a really high precision, but the reconstruction. So there's a few things you can do well, like eye color, or someone has blue eyes, you could tell. But how is that coming along? Like, what are your expectations for that in the next decade? I guess the dream is to make sketch artists irrelevant.
The dream for me is, I told you earlier, like I believe uncertainty is a big enemy of criminal justice, and so this uncertainty comes from the lack of investment in technology in criminal justice, and then the technology that's there is a lot of it's older and outdated. I mean, you hear these horror stories about people using bite mark analysis and blood splatter analysis. So for me, the dream is that we bring technology, right? We bring technology into criminal justice so we can cost effectively and quickly just understand what happened. When I was in biomedicine, and I know you experience this as well, there's a need to kind of predict outcome, right? Like what are the risks, for future illness? And I always felt it's hard to be in the fortune telling business. It's hard to be in the business of predicting the future. But in criminal justice, you're essentially trying to figure out what happened in the past. It's already happened. It's just a matter of developing the right tools with the right resolution and granularity that can help us understand with certainty what happened. So I love the business we're in. I love being able to predict what happened in the past because it already happened. Should be able to know what happened and deploy these tools such that we can quickly know what happened and then take the right steps to move the case forward. And that's really what it is. And that's not about using our technology as the last resort. It's not about trying every method. And then, what it is about taking the shortest path to getting a robust answer. So yeah, I have nothing against, forensic sketch artists or anybody. There's a lot of tools for a lot of things, but in the long term, we should be advocating for the simplest, straightforward approach that can cost effectively get us the answer we need. And I just think in a lot of these cases, the simplest way to know who was at the crime scene is just to do DNA testing. That's certainly going to be true for human remains. I mean, of course, you can, draw a face, you can figure out through isotope testing where they may have eaten or lived in their days, but DNA testing will just tell you who the person is. and sometimes I just wonder, it's like, who needs a face if you can just get a name, get the name, figure out who they are, and then begin the investigation to understand what happened to them. Are they a victim of a crime? Did they die incidentally? So, I think deploying the right technology and doing it in a cost-effective way, fewer steps is possible, and something that is robust and scalable. I want to tell you, a lot of the times, these kind of new pieces of technology, they get thrust upon the world, and they're used in the most important cases or the highest profile cases. The technology we build, I can't emphasize to you, we get the same outcomes for the smallest agencies in America that have no lab and not even a single forensic scientist. We can get the same outcomes for them that we get for the Bureau. And that's a very leveling and kind of equalizing technology. It can bring the same outcomes to everyone, regardless of where you are in the country, really regardless of where you are in the world, and regardless of what infrastructure you have. If you know how to use FedEx, or you can come to our facility and hand deliver evidence, you're ready to go. So that's something that we really pride ourselves on. Some of these agencies don't even have the capabilities to extract DNA. And so we'll work with the primary evidence, skeletal remains, whatever you have. So being able to make sure that we can not only bring cost-effective and very powerful technology, but do it in a way that it can be distributed evenly is a real mission for us. And I think that's what's going to create the real seismic shift in criminal justice for everyone.
Yeah, I like talking to you because this technology is here. It's going to be used. I think people are mystified by DNA. They think some sort of panopticon, but the reality is, it's just part of the life that we live in the 21st century. And people just need to be aware of it, and it can do great. Obviously, it can do other things as well in the wrong hands. But I guess we just got to make sure that the right people are using these tools, right?
Yes. I think that's something that's been concerning to us since the beginning. And so if you look at Othram, you'll see you can look at our terms of service. We don't offer medical testing. You can't bring me grandma's heirloom. We don't take artifacts from random folks. I don't know how to address those kind of concerns right now. So the way we've approached the problem is that Othram works within the criminal justice system. So a forensic laboratory, generally like a public lab, a detective, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, someone in the criminal justice community is going to surface to us a legitimate law enforcement investigation. And it's at that point that we'll get involved. I suspect there'll be ways to deploy this technology, perhaps to even more folks. I just don't know how to do it. So we've elected to make Othram, law enforcement only. I know there are folks that are, we've had people reach out and say, look, I have this like one tooth left from my ancestor. There's nothing else I can do. I really want to build a profile, and we just don't take that kind of work right now. That, and I think there's, never mind the concerns and the risks, but there's also countless cases right now that need to be addressed, human remains and unsolved crimes. So I think there'll be enough work to keep us busy for the next, decade. I don't think there's an urgency to go try to turn this into a consumer offering.
Yeah. Sounds like it. Well, David, it was nice catching up with you after these, it's been 3.5 years. Seems like a lot of progress is made. Maybe in 3.5 years, we'll be talking about Othram at the UN or something like that. I don't know how global, how much you guys are going to scale up, but it seems like you guys made a lot of progress.
We want, I appreciate it. We want to go global, but I think right now there's a lot of work to do right here in our own country. And so we've got, we're supporting some legislation. There's an act, the Carla Walker Act, named after Carla Walker. We discussed her case, and it's being championed by Senator John Cornyn, who's been behind a lot of the really great DNA bills in our country. And he's championing this bill, hopefully imminently introducing it. And it would provide the infrastructure for public labs and the funding for agencies and labs to use this technology at scale. The technology is ready to go. It just takes a little bit of federal leadership and funding. a couple of $1 billion were spent bringing CODIS into the mainstream for public labs and for investigating agencies. And we'll need a certain number of events to occur to make sure this technology like CODIS can be deployed, again, broadly and evenly to law enforcement and public labs across the country. So we're very excited about that. And again, if anyone wants to follow what we're doing, we announce a case every day. Today, we're recording this podcast and we announced a case an hour before we had this conversation. I'm sure there'll be another case tomorrow and the next day. So you can see what we're doing on Othram.com. We have a real-time tracker of cases that resolve. And anyone that wants to look under the hood, we're very transparent, research.othram.com. Come check out our articles and our explanations and open access, scientific literature. And if anyone comes back to you, Razib, with questions or things that they would love to know more about, we'll certainly take those as guidance for future things to write about. We're always looking for something exciting to write about that we think will engage folks. Mm-hmm. I think bringing this technology to everyone so everyone can examine it, dissect it, and explore it is key, whether that's consumers trying to decide if they want to participate in the database, whether it's prosecutors or defense attorneys wanting to learn more about this before they discuss it in court. We really want to make sure everyone has access to the information they need to determine how and where to use this technology.
Yeah, as I said, we have the technology, so onward and upward. All right, David, I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite